Right. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Symposium for the Earth Institute Postdoctoral Fellows. My name is John Mata, and I'm director of the program. And so if any of you are PhD students looking for a postdoc opportunity, I'm the person to talk to about this postdoc program. I'm also Director of Graduate Studies for the PhD in Sustainable Development. So if you're at that stage and you're interested in PhD, I'm also the person to talk to. We have these symposia twice a year, once a semester, to present to the university community and others the work that the postdocs are doing. What you'll recognize, not unlike the PhD program, is that everyone is different. There is no specific theme, save that they should be germane to the broadest issues of sustainable development. But within that, they can be practically anything. So you'll see the diversity in the presentations. You'll see the excellence of the scholarship and the enthusiasm of the postdocs. So without further ado, there'll be 4 talks. You can ask questions after each one. There's an audience mic, but at the very end, if you have a question that you forgot to ask early on, you can ask later at the end of it. Okay, so typically, the subject of the first talk by Xiaohu Feng and Maria Uriarte is very typical of the sort of things we're interested in. What's going to happen when the climate inevitably changes? And it's also the signature of the program, apart from the diversity of subject area, excellence of the postdocs, is the pairing with the mentor. Maria Uriarte is on the faculty here at U3B, just to shorten that, and the two work together on the same project for two years, and that's the way we've structured the program. So, to begin. Yes.
Should I start?
Yep.
Should I start? Okay. Thanks, John, for introducing me. I am Xiaohui, but I usually go by Sunny, so I'm more known as Sunny. So my work is on an investigation of how tropical forests respond to climate change through integration of field work and ecosystem model. So my big question is, how do tropical forests respond to climatic variability? More specifically, is drought and warming. The GCM models have predicted that this planet is going to be a warmer planet. As some areas become drier, maybe some areas become wetter, but in tropical forests, it's going to become significantly drier at my site, my study site. So under a warmer and drier climate, we want to know how much carbon the tropical forest can sequester. Maybe it will turn into a source from a sink. So, however, there are many ecosystem models that can predict responses of forest in terms of carbon stocks and carbon fluxes, but these models have not agreed with each other what's the magnitude of the change, and they probably haven't even agreed on what's the direction of the change. So whether it will flip or not, whether it will maintain as a carbon sink. So my goal of this work is try to improve the predictive capacity of this ecosystem, specifically one ecosystem model, try to quantify how tropical forests are going to respond to climate change. So my study site is in a forest in Puerto Rico. You can see over there, it's the here is the Ruquillo experiment forest, and then the site I'm using, the plot I'm using is called Ruquillo Forest Dynamic Plot. It's a 16-hectare forest plot. In this plot, since 1990, every tree in this plot with a diameter of more than 1 centimeter at breast height were measured and mapped at every 5-year interval. So like every 5 years, they will have a census in the forest, and then to count the trees, map the trees, and measure the deviation of all the trees. And then all the data that I have been using are from this LTER site. And then, so this is my model. The model I am using is called Ecosystem Demography Model. The second version is called ED2. It's kind of like the model now, like in the forest ecosystem modeling, because it is an individual-based model, and it is driven by physiology, and then it can predict the ecosystem structure, like above ground biomass and like size distribution structure, vegetation height, LAI, and this kind of terms. And then it can also predict carbon fluxes like NPP, NEP, GPP, and carbon stocks. So, and this model has a leaf photosynthesis model module, and then it uses the Century module, Century model as the below ground soil carbon. And it also has mechanisms for mortality, dispersal, and recruitment, and also you can also include event files such as hurricane and fire. So this model works on a plant functional type. So it has 5 PFTs, and PFT 2, 3, and 4 are tropical PFTs. So the first thing we would do to model the forest in my site is to assign all the species in that site to these 3 functional types. So the 3 functional types over here are listed as early successional tropical PFT, and mid successional, and late successional. So early successional trees basically are the pioneer species. So if you have a gap in the forest, those species come in first. They usually grow faster with higher photosynthetic rate, and then the wood density is usually lower. They're softer wood, but they grow faster. And then late successional trees usually are hardwood trees. They usually show up in a very old forest. So these are the difference among early and mid and late successional trees. And then we had around 150 species in the forest, and then we managed to assign all of them into these 3 plant functional types based on some experts' understanding of these trees, but not me. So and then here is just a table, like simply listing all the trees in each PFT, but there are only 30 species over here. These are the most abundant 10 species in each plant functional type, but this species accounts for more than 80% of all the trees, and they're listed by abundance. So for example, like this Pristoia, it's a palm species. It is very, very abundant in the forest. It accounts for like 40% of the plant cover totally. And it is, right now we list it as a late successional because it is more closely to late successional trees physiologically, but it can also be listed as a mid successional because from successional stage, palm species are more like a mid successional tree. But right now, it's listed as late successional because during the later I will tell you why. But in the future job, we probably want to list this species as a separate plant functional type because it's so different from other species. But that's future work, just future development. And then, so for the initial conditions for the model simulation, we used the census data to map all the trees. So it's just a single site run. It's not regional. So we're only running the model at Ruquillo at this site. And then our plot is a 16-hectare plot. So one plot is a patch in the model, and then each tree is considered as a cohort. And then you can see that from this initialization, initial condition, you can tell where the each PFT are. So there are 3 plant functional types based on the species to PFT list. So all the trees are mapped. So when the model starts to simulate, the model already knows that which PFT are where. So all the trees are mapped. And then next, I'm going to go through model parameterization, model validation, and the predictions we have made using the model, like step by step. Every model has parameters. So this model has around 50 parameters, but we have chosen 11 parameters from this model to parameterize based on previous work, because we have found that these parameters, the model is more sensitive to these parameters. The outputs of the model gets affected a lot by these parameters. So we want to get these parameters right to make appropriate predictions. And then I'll show you the parameters that we have chosen over here. So these are the 11 parameters that we have parameterized. The gray line over here are the prior distributions. So basically, the prior distributions are from data collected from later research from a broader scale. Like, they are not site specific. They're just from the trees from tropical forest. And then the black points over here are the data that we have collected from the species from our site. And then the black line over here is the posterior distribution. So we fit the prior distribution and the data through a meta-analysis model, and then we get the posterior distribution. So all the parameters that we get for this model are distributions. They are not a single point value. So with these distributions, we can propagate the uncertainty to model output, because these are distributions. So we have uncertainty in the parameter. We are not sure that what's the point, the actual point. There's no actual point. I mean, different species have different values. That's why we get a distribution here instead of a single point value. So and then we can sample from this parameter distribution, and then we get a distribution. We get a parameter set, and then we use this set and then to run the model, and then we can sample again from this parameter distribution. We get another parameter set with a totally different parameter values, and then we run the model again. So we can run the model like 1,000 times or 500 times by sampling from these parameters, and then we can get a distribution of the model outputs. So these are the parameters. And then, oh, by the way, these 4 parameters over here, they just have a line over here. That's because we didn't have any data from our site. So we used the prior distribution as a posterior distribution. And then, so for to run the model, we used the weather data from the Alberta station, weather station from the forest to drive the model. So the model only takes hourly weather data. in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of like the electricity just goes out. So we had a lot of gaps in our weather data, and replicates just messed up like values. So it took a lot of time to gap fill all the weather data. So the model does not tolerate any gaps, any repeats. So we managed to clean the data from 2002 to 2016. So we had precipitation, radiation, temperature, humidity, wind speed, wind direction. So, and then we ran the model from 2002 to 2016 for model validation. So what we did is we, as earlier I mentioned, the parameter distributions. So we sampled 500 parameter sets from the distribution, and then we initialized the model using the census data, and then we ran the model from over here, 1990 to 2002. They had censuses from the forest that they had observations, but we didn't have weather data, so we couldn't run the model like for this period. So this is the period we actually run the model. This is from 2002. Actually, this is 2012, but because by the point they hadn't finished the 2016 census yet, but they have already finished it now. So I used the 2002 and 2016 data. And then we validated the model using this 3 metrics: above ground biomass, DBH growth, and size distribution structure. So here's the model validation. So we want to validate the model to make sure that the model is matching observations, and then the model is behaving properly so we can make proper reliable predictions. So here's the above ground biomass, and this is still on PFT level. So the blue line over here is late successional, and this is mid successional, and this is early successional. So the black data points over here are observations. You can see that this is at around every 5 years we had a census. So this is above ground biomass. You can tell that the late successional trees contributes the highest biomass in the forest because they are mostly like larger trees. As you know, that larger trees contributes the highest biomass in the forest. And then this is a size distribution. It's just a proportion of bigger trees in the community. So here's the late successional. You can tell from this figure the late successional has a much higher proportion of larger trees compared to the other PFTs. That's why they have so high biomass over here. And then this is relative DBH growth. We had annually DBH growth data from 2013 to 2015 to validate the growth. And then you can see there's a drop over here across all PFTs. That's because there was a drought in 2015. So the annual precipitation at this site is around 3,500 millimeter a year. But in 2015, we only got around 2,000 millimeters. So that's a big drought that happened, almost like half of average value. That's why you can see a decrease in growth among all the trees. And then this is the MPP. Very unfortunately, we didn't have flux towers at this site, so we cannot validate this data. The only thing we can do is to look at other tropical forests, see if they had other forests that had measurements, and then the average value, our value fits in the normal range, the average value which is around 1 kg carbon per square meter per year. So that fits in the normal range. And then so after we validated the model, we made sure the model matched the observations well, and then we made predictions using the climate change scenarios. So what we did is we applied 2 Celsius warming from 2017 to 2050, like linearly, like gradually, the temperature increased gradually, but by 2050, the temperature has increased by 2 Celsius from now. And then we also applied a 50% reduction of precipitation. And then you can see this is, so this dashed line over here is year 2016. So on the right side of this line is a prediction of the future. So you can see a biomass drop of like almost all 3 PFCs, but with the biggest drop in above ground biomass in late successional. And then you can also see a shift of size structure. So basically the model is predicting that the forest is going to be more dominated with small trees instead of larger trees. And this is the DBH growth. You can see a decrease of DBH among all 3 PFTs. And then the green line over here is the NPP, is the model predicted NPP. So this decrease of DBH growth is correlated with the decrease of net primary productivity of the forest. And then here's this panel shows the net ecosystem productivity, which is NEP. So when NEP is positive, that means this ecosystem is still absorbing carbon. But when this number turns from positive to negative, that means the ecosystem flips from carbon sink to carbon source. So our model is predicting that by 2036, you can see this threshold over here. The model is flipping from a sink to a source. So at this point, it's around 30% reduction of precipitation and 1.2 degree of warming from now. So that's kind of scary. And then this is the predictions under future climate scenario. And then we also did a comparison of different stress scenarios. So the black line over here is combined drought and warming. So it's the same scenario as the figures that you have seen in last slide. And then the red line is warming only, and the blue line is drought only. So you can see that so a combined stress scenario so is the worst over here. So this is the turning point over here. So if the stress is combined, so you have both warming and drying, then it turns flips from sink to source much earlier than separated stress scenarios. And also what's driving the changes, the mechanism is also different. So if we apply warming only, then the decrease in this NEP is majorly driven by the increase of heterotrophic respiration. You know that under higher temperature, respiration usually goes up. So this is majorly driven by the increase of respiration. But if it's under drought only, the drop in NEP is majorly driven by the reduce of gross primary productivity. Basically, under drought, the plants cannot do photosynthesis as well as in normal conditions. So I don't know how much time I have. I can end over here, or there's another story. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I mean this is a complete story already, but it's just next one is just for future development that I have talked about earlier. So yeah, so I'll just jump to my last slide with conclusions. So basically, late successional trees, they contribute the highest biomass in the forest, but they get affected most by climate change. And then this decrease of biomass is majorly due to dieback of larger trees. And then forest turns from sink to source at around 2036. And then different parameters, they contributed differently in model and in the uncertainty in model output. And then I would thank my advisor, Maria, and the lab. And then thanks for the Luquil ITER site and Earth Institute and NSF for funding sources. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sunny. Stay there. We do have time for a few questions. So if you have something to ask.
Yes, Alex?
So your model was fine-tuned for Puerto Rico, correct?
Yes, that's right.
How applicable is this to other biosystems in the Earth, across the Earth?
Actually, this is a future development. We are trying to apply the model to Panama and Amazon. But there's a delay in the climate data cleaning in those sites. Also, we would like to have species data to parameterize the model because the more, if you are site-specific and species-specific, then you get more better predictions. But we can, because those forest sites, they are also tropical. We can try to use the same set of parameters, but if the model do not do well, like in predictions, then we can try to collect more data to try to tune the model to those sites. But this model has already been used and tested in a lot of temporary forests, like Duke Forest, like Howard Forest. So yes, but tropical forest, this is this is new.
Yeah, I've got a quick question.
Sure.
And that is, when you talk about 2036 as being a tipping point of sorts, what about the evidence that shows that most of the models, climate models, are accelerating? So could you speculate that if we have acceleration going on, that maybe your tipping point is maybe 2030 instead of 2036? Is that within your margin of error?
I understand what you're saying. So this is totally depends on the climate driver that we're using. So yeah, so right now the driver that we're using has it's a linear increase in temperature and reduction of precipitation. But if we want to test other scenarios, like you mentioned, like we can totally apply a different set of climate drivers and then see the model, how the model predicts. Yeah. Sure.
Hey, Sunny. One question. So 2 degrees and 50% reduction, I mean, that's pretty drastic, right, for 2050. So, I mean, 2100 should be more like 2 degrees or something. So do you think there would be an effect of lag? Because one could think that photosynthesis is pretty like instantaneous, whereas respiration is more like time integrative somehow. So I don't know if you tested that, what would be the impact of just the time scale? Instead of applying the same impact on 2050, doing that over like 2100, but the same magnitude.
Thanks, Pierre. That's a good question. So yeah. So what we are using, so the average prediction of GCM is that by 2100, the temperature increases by 2 degrees. So the reason that we use by 2050 is because we want to predict a broad range of temperature changes. Because if we only want to predict from 2002 and 2050, but we want to increase the temperature by 2 degrees, but not by 1 degree, because we want to see the change from by 1 degree to by 2 degrees. You see what I mean? But the reason we only did until 2050 because it takes very long for the model to run for 1 century. It will take like double the time and double the work. We will get a lot of upper files. So, but yeah, but I think that's a good point. But it just takes time to implement.
Thank you. My question has to do with the parameterization. You had 11 parameters in the plant functional types that you chose as most sensitive, but a third of those you had no data from.
Correct.
And that third are the ones probably most sensitive to temperature and water, things like stomatal responses and respiratory responses. So my question is, can you do a sensitivity analysis to know which of those 11 parameters is having the biggest impact and therefore where the data needs are the greatest?
That's an excellent point, actually. So I had this one slide that I skipped, that I did a sensitivity analysis for the parameter, that your point was right. So the parameters without I can show you over here. This is the data, the parameter we didn't actually have any data. So the parameters without data, which had a broader distribution, the model output is more sensitive to those parameters. So that means our next step is going to collect some data for those parameters and then constrain them and then rerun the model and then see how the model does. That's excellent. Thank you.
Sunny. The next speaker is Alexander Karambellis, I know how to say it, who asked the first question to the previous speaker, and she'll speak on a very different but equally important subject of urban and rural modelling air pollution variances in India. And if you've ever been to an Indian city recently, you'll know how important this is.
See if I can find it. Oops. Ah, there I am. Perfect. Perfect. Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and thank you for that introduction, John. I am here to present some results from using air quality models to evaluate air quality in India, and kind of go into a little bit more on my second project, focusing on trying to best estimate these urban and rural variances that we saw in my first the first part of this work that I conducted during my dissertation. So a little bit of motivation first to kind of set the stage. Why am I interested in studying air quality in India? Why is it relevant? It is home to more than 1.25 billion people, quite very populated country in a very small area. So the land area of India is about half the size of the contiguous United States. So there's a lot of people crammed into a pretty small area. And people tend to produce a lot of pollution, for instance, through transportation or combustion for heating and cooking purposes and electricity generation. So that, coupled with limited emissions regulations, has led to significant pollution levels indicated in these images, as well as, for instance, maybe you saw in the news back in November, there were through the culmination of the Diwali celebration and the biomass burning season, and then just general pollution in the region in general, concentrations of fine particulate matter exceeded 1,000 micrograms per cubic meter, which, to put that into perspective, in the United States, our air quality standard for PM 2.5 is an annual average of 12. So orders of magnitude different pollution conditions that they're dealing with in India. And unfortunately, this has negative health implications. I listed a couple studies. There have been a handful of other studies looking at estimates of human health impacts for various cardiovascular and respiratory diseases and what that means for premature mortality. And I note that the estimates fall between, in the case of these three studies, between 486 and 811,000. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty in the estimates being derived from various calculations and using different exposure rates to get these estimates of premature mortality. And so I kind of fit in because I'm interested in, as you'll see in a bit, drawing these connections between air quality and human health and kind of what feeds into that air quality in the region. So first, what is PM 2.5? This is a schematic just showing some kind of size comparisons between PM 2.5 that are denoted in the red. So those are suspended liquids and aerosols that are very small, that are less than 2.5 micrometers in diameter. They often come from combustion processes, so fossil fuel burning and for transportation and electricity generation, or bonfires, things like that. The reason that we care about PM 2.5 is that they're very small particles, and so they're so small that you can breathe them in and they can get into your bloodstream, and they can cause significant problems related to cardiovascular and respiratory issues, ultimately can end up leading to premature death. Generally, if we breathe in coarser particulates, we'll end up coughing those out, but those PM 2.5 particles are quite dangerous. And once we even start talking about smaller particles, it's even more health damaging. So India's air quality hasn't always been awful. However, due to economic growth and transportation increases, where people are owning and using more personal vehicles, and urbanization and just general population growth, emissions have been increasing. And so this is just to show from several different emissions inventories how, through the past several decades, emissions of various PM 2.5 component precursors and other pollutants have been increasing across the country, sometimes doubling or quadrupling over the past several decades. And so these emissions tend to come from the sources that I've kind of talked about a little bit so far, so transportation, electricity generation, and that biomass combustion. Now those were kind of bottom-up estimates of looking at emissions from the country as a whole, but we can also observe these changes over time from space. And so these are just two images of satellite trends in satellite observations from the ozone monitoring instrument, which is aboard the Polar Orbiting Aura satellite. And so we get an image about once a day, and over a long period of time we can assess how pollution is changing for nitrogen dioxide on the left and sulfur dioxide on the right from the early mid-2000s to the 2010s. And this is useful because it shows us where across the region things are changing more rapidly, less rapidly, if things are decreasing, or if pollution is decreasing, and how those vary across the country. Unfortunately, there are some limitations with satellite observations, namely that they measure the entirety of the tropospheric column, which doesn't necessarily give you good the most accurate representation of the surface pollution, which can cause problems when you're thinking about how this relates to policymaking and how it relates to understanding those human health implications. So to kind of fill in, or the best available data to use for those kind of purposes are surface observations. This is a plot of available surface observations in India from about a week ago or so, with the lighter colors denoting cleaner air quality and lower concentrations of PM 2.5, and the red indicating higher concentrations of PM 2.5. I think the first thing you'll note is that, well, most of the monitors in the circles are yellow and red. They're quite high concentrations. The scale is kind of small, but it's 61.1 is yellow and 97.8 and up is red. The other thing that you'll note is that there's a lot of the country that's left uncovered. And so there's a lot of regions, including many states, without a single monitor. And so we don't really have a best estimate of what's actually going on with the PM 2.5 concentrations and levels and how they change over time through much of the region. Another thing I'd like to point out is, maybe this will work. Can you see a mouse? No. Well, you can note that in some of the major cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Bangalore, they have significant amounts of monitors as opposed to that are kind of clustered in those major cities. So, oh, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, we can kind of point out where these are. And so where we can see that there are many urban monitors as opposed to more rural monitors. And so, again, kind of feeding into the point that we don't really have a good sense of what's going on between these monitor locations at the surface or through time. So with all that motivation, just kind of bringing it back to my research and what I'm interested in, and I'm really fascinated with understanding how energy sector emissions and meteorology connect with ambient air pollution and ultimately have implications for human health. So understanding how pollution and how sectors that are affecting pollution affect human health, what this means for technology innovation. So thinking about how we can reduce our emissions and what kind of technologies we can apply to different sectors, and how understanding the contributions leads to that knowledge. And then ultimately policy making and how can we enact policies and legislation to encourage the use of these technologies and thereby reduce emissions and reduce ambient air quality and improve human health. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that the main tool that I use is an air quality model. This is just a little schematic of what kind of goes into a model. It's hundreds of complex chemical and meteorological equations, and that are used to feed into these different modules related to gas phase chemistry, aerosol thermodynamics, cloud processes, and dispersion and advection from each grid cell from one grid cell to the next. The model I use is CMAQ, or the Community Multi-Scale Air Quality Model. It's an EPA developed and used model that's used to design and study various policy implications across the United States. And the model itself has been used in a variety of different regions across the world, including Europe and China. And now this is one of the first uses of it in India. So that's kind of exciting. But all these processes actually need inputs. So I've labeled some of them here. We have emissions, so from example, transportation, power plants, domestic combustion, so those anthropogenic emissions. We also have emissions from plants and trees, or those natural sources. And then ultimately we need some kind of boundary conditions, some global inflow, and then meteorology to kind of encourage all these processes to happen. Now once you run the model a few times, get it, compare with observations and get a sense of how the model is performing, we can try to draw some conclusions from it. So I'm just going to show you one of the major key findings from a set of larger simulations that I ran, looking at the entire Indian subcontinent at a coarse resolution, 36 kilometer by 36 kilometer, for 4 seasonally representative months, January, April, July, and October. And I took the averages of those compared with a couple different observational data sets. And what really struck me and kind of popped out to me was that through comparing nitrogen dioxide in the column and at the surface, there were some interesting disparities between urban and rural biases. So here I'm showing on the left comparisons in the tropospheric column. So NO2 modeled is in the green, NO2 from the satellite is in this blue hatching. And then comparing on the right with the surface observations, and so NO2 again from the model in green, and observations from the Central Pollution Control Board, or an EPA equivalent monitor network, in the light blue, and from the dark blue, comparing with observations from the literature. And you'll note, hopefully, that if we focus both just on the urban monitors first, that the model estimated concentrations of NO2 at the surface and in the column are pretty comparable to what is observed through using these resources. However, taking a closer look at the rural, we see significant discrepancies in the model, between the model and the observation. So the model exhibits a significant low bias in these rural areas. I want to point out, though, that this is really quite important because the rural area across India is significantly greater than urban. Here I'm defining urban as grid cells where the population is greater than 5,000 people per kilometer squared. And so most of those are clustered around the major cities. So there are very few of those in terms of area as opposed to these rural grid cells. And so if we're underestimating what these rural concentrations are, we have to think back, okay, what goes into estimating these concentrations. And the major factor that contributes to these are in our emissions inventory. So in thinking about this, I designed another experiment, again using CMAQ, but this time at a higher resolution to kind of capture any urban and rural gradients and variations. And then I also updated some key emission sectors with more high resolution urban and rural factors. So for instance, for transportation, we split up state level emissions based off of urban and rural factors, where urban transportation was more dominated by two-wheeled motorbikes, and the rural transportation was dominated by heavy-duty diesel buses. And again, so kind of incorporated these updates to 3 sectors, plugged them in with the rest of the anthropogenic emissions, and reran CMAQ again for those seasonally representative months at a higher resolution of 12 kilometer by 12 kilometer. And so then just walking through some of the inputs and how the inputs changed from the larger domain to the smaller domain, and then going over what does that mean for those model sensitivities to these emissions inputs, and trying to get a sense of if we're able to use this information to better resolve these urban and rural differences within the model output. So here, just walking through the changes to the domestic combustion sector just for primary PM2.5, which is in the form of elemental and organic carbon. Again, on the left, those are the baseline emissions. So for the larger domain simulation, and they look very similar for the global simulation as well as a high resolution. So if we were to use these for the 12 kilometer baseline as well, this is what would be fed into it. And so generally you see that there's not too much going on really. There's some hot spots in Delhi and Kolkata, but everything else is pretty low with regards to PM2.5 emissions. However, when we introduce these updates, we see many more regions of localized increases, and those are due to those urban and rural splits reallocated based off of urban and rural population data. So what ends up happening is that we move some emissions from broader areas into a more concentrated area, thereby increasing locally and decreasing regionally. Similarly, for transportation, we see the same kind of thing, where there are some more regions of concentrated emissions. And then for power plants, this is probably the most stunning, because this is not based off urban and rural population information or activity information. This is based off of where power plants actually exist. So taking the latitude and longitude information, and instead of just gridding based off of some estimate of sulfur dioxide emissions from nearby power plants, actually gridding them to their location in real life using latitude and longitudes. So then what does this actually mean for the model simulations, and what do we see from this? Like, how does this affect the CMAQ output? Here I'm showing those an annual average estimated using those seasonally representative simulations. On the left is the simulation for PM2.5, including all of those emissions updates. And on the right includes just the baseline. So the first thing that you'll note is that concentrations of PM2.5 are greatest in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, where we have more people. So this makes sense because we have more people, more combustion, more emissions, more PM2.5. But you'll note that there are, between the baseline and the updates, there are significant differences. So now this is showing the percent difference between those two simulations. So generally across the entire region, there are significant decreases just from reallocating those emissions. So it shows some pretty significant model sensitivities. However, we have these pockets of localized increases. So we can think PM2.5 is kind of complicated, right? It has primary components and secondary components. And so what's driving these increases and decreases? Well, our localized increases are predominantly due to those primary components, that elemental carbon and organic carbon, which makes sense, because if we're feeding more emissions into a concentrated area, we're going to have more PM2.5 in those regions as a result of these direct emissions. And due to atmospheric chemistry, most of the regional decreases are due to the fact that secondary pollutants like sulfate and nitrate don't increase, they decrease across the entire region as a result of these updates. Now, PM2.5 and its components aren't the only thing that the model is sensitive to. Obviously, sulfate and nitrate come from somewhere. They come from sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide. And so we see the same kind of changes in these difference plots that we saw for PM2.5, but in these gas-based species as well. And ozone is quite interesting, but I didn't prepare a plot of ozone, but there's some interesting NOx titration effects that are affected. And so that kind of leads into the fact that the model chemistry in itself is sensitive to where these emissions are actually located, which is really quite fascinating. But just to kind of highlight some things is that through these updates to the emissions, we're able to see in the ambient concentrations predicted by the model these localized regions of high NO2 concentrations, high SO2 concentrations, which is really quite exciting, especially because they were getting washed out in the larger simulations, which I don't have here. So you have to take my word for it. But from these differences, you can kind of see where regionally the increases and decreases are. And most of these increases and decreases in the nitrogen dioxide is a result of those transportation and domestic combustion emissions. So we're moving across a broad area emissions based off of urban and rural activities. Whereas these changes to SO2 are largely driven by changes to the locations of power plants. And so if we have, a power plant was in the wrong location before, and now we moved it and it's in the right place and it's emitting an appropriate amount of emissions, then we would expect to see this kind of increase. So just to conclude, that modifying emissions based off of their gridding location and according to updated information leads to substantial changes in our modeled air quality system, which is really fascinating to see how both the primary and emissions and atmospheric chemistry are affected by those emissions changes. That the model runs reflect changes both in local effects and regional effects. And this, I feel, speaks to the fact that it's really important to have this updated information, because if we're just gridding emissions based off of some kind of state level or country level population density, we might be losing a lot of the nuances between those urban and rural areas. And using that information then could feed back into having into a poorer understanding of how people are actually affected by the air quality in the region. So ultimately, how does this research affect understanding premature mortality and across these urban and rural areas? So with that, I'll take any questions.
Well, thanks, Alex. That's wonderful. I have a question.
Yeah.
The impact you talk about you only mention premature mortality. Doesn't PM 2.5 have a lot more other health effects?
Yes, so the premature mortality is that I'm interested in is a result of predominantly 4 health issues. So I would take into account cardiovascular, pulmonary disease, COPD, I can't remember what it actually stands for, ischemic heart disease, stroke, and lung cancer. So taking those 4 things into account. And so this is kind of the work that I'm interested in related to premature mortality kind of disregards like the life years impacted by the air quality.
You're not including effects on children?
Correct.
Babies?
Correct, because a lot of that information is hard to come by. Most epidemiological studies on health effects as a result of air quality are on adults.
Okay, even though it affects children.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now my questions. So if there are others, I'd love to hear them. I should have mentioned that there is an abstract of everybody's talk in your folder, so if you're able to read in the dark, you'll be able to follow along. Okay? Oh, a question.
Thank you. So it seems like the increased resolution of the kind of ground truthing you did would be very helpful to this model being applied like in the States or other countries. Have you explored that, or are you trying to put that out there? I don't know if you've thought about that.
So the reason that I implemented this information for the emissions inventory in India is because we don't have a lot of that information for emissions in India. We have a lot of that. We have county level information and roadway information and all sorts of stuff that is important to building these emissions inventories in the US and in Europe. It's harder to come by everywhere else. And so trying to take some of the methodologies that we have implemented for modeling air quality in more developed regions and tying that into these ongoing economic development countries is part of why I did this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, if you think of a question later, we'll make time for that. So moving on, the next talk will be given by Ding Ma, and it's titled Effects of Orography and Surface Heat Fluxes on the South Asian Summer Monsoon. it could have a much longer title that would be on which billions of people depend for many things.
Oops. Okay. Oh, I just gave you a preview. Okay. Thank you all for coming. And my name is Dean, and today I'm going to talk about the effects of orography and surface flux on the South Asian monsoon. And for most of the results I'm going to show you, I have been working with Jiming Kwang from Harvard, who was my advisor, and Bill Booth from Yale. And in the end, I will show you some of the ongoing work that I have been working here. So as you may know, there are a couple of monsoon systems on Earth, the American monsoon, Australian monsoon, and Asian monsoon. The South Asian monsoon is the most dominant, most prominent monsoon system in terms of strength and area that it influences and the population it covers. And the great strength of the South Asian monsoon has been attributed to the orography. To be specific, I'm talking about the huge bulk of the Tibetan Plateau and also the high mountains of Himalayas. And I'd like to start with a quick question. So what do you think is most important to the strength of the South Asian monsoon? A, the huge bulk of the Tibetan Plateau, and B, the Himalayas, and C, Morningside Heights. Put up your hand if you think A, Tibetan Plateau is the most important factor. No one? Okay. And B, Himalayas? Okay. I see a couple of them. And then the rest of you chooses C, I guess? Okay. It will be very difficult to convince you then. So the classic idea that the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, the system, drives a strong monsoon as a elevated heat source, which means in the summer, when the sun is over here, the air over the plateau is heated so that air here is warmer than the air at the same height over India. Warmer air rises and draws in moist air from the ocean into Indian subcontinent and brings precipitation and forms such a circulation, the monsoon circulation. However, in that case, if the Tibetan Plateau is really a heat source to the monsoon system, we are supposed to see high temperature and high entropy over the plateau. But recent studies show that the maximum entropy, or you can think of it as temperature, a combination of temperature and moisture. Recent studies show that you will see maximum entropy actually over the Indian instead of the Tibetan Plateau, which suggests that the orography here works as an insulation instead of a heating source to the system, which means it's a wall that preserves the thermal maximum south of it over India against the cold and dry air in the north. There are a few studies trying to test this idea. They played with the orography and they played with surface fluxes and showed that we'll still have a strong monsoon when the Tibetan Plateau is removed. However, in the previous studies, the problem is in the GCMs, the general circulation models, the resolution is pretty coarse. As Alex just pointed out, the resolution is really important. We can see here the Himalayas is really, really narrow. The range of it is around 300 or 400 kilometers. And in previous studies, in the GCMs, the resolution is around, let's say, 200 kilometers. So it can barely resolve the narrow range of Himalayas. And that's why I'm doing the study and using very high resolution. So here, the resolution I have is 40 kilometer globe around. And besides the control, I have two sets of experiments in which I'm going to change the orography and I'm going to change the surface heat fluxes over different regions. Also, I want to point out that I'm using a special technique called RAVE, Reduced Acceleration in the Vertical, in which basically you can think of it as shrinking the Earth while make it rotating faster. So we are solving the same equations as the real Earth, but doing some trick. In this case, we can simulate convections explicitly. As you learned from previous study, as you learned from Xiaohui's talk, people have been using parameterizations for different things. And traditionally, in this kind of simulations, people are parameterizing convections, which means based on empirical or lab experiments, they are trying to simulate convection implicitly, which causes a lot of problems because in that case, the parameterizations depends on specific cases a lot and does not work well all the time. So the thing is here we are able to simulate convections explicitly in a large scale, actually global scale simulation. So starting from the experiment called Wall 90, the Tibetan Plateau is removed and 90% of Himalayas is preserved. And thanks to the fine resolution, I'm able to decrease the height of Himalayas gradually to see how it changes the monsoon system till there's no orography at all. And in the second set experiments in which the surface heat fluxes are reduced, in different regions, I played with the surface fluxes, for example, over Tibetan Plateau, over the Himalayas, and over different regions in India. And I'd like to point out that I'm reducing surface heat flux by 150 watts per meter square uniformly over the regions. So the total perturbation depends on the area of the regions that I played with. And in fact, the areas of these three experiments are the same, which is 1/3 of the area of this experiment. So the total perturbation is 3 times in the experiment Tibet than the other 3. And let's see how the monsoon system looks like. Starting from the upper right panel, in the summer, we see a strong southwesterlies over India, which brings in moisture into the continent, and therefore there's a lot of precipitation in this area. And as I mentioned before, in the upper level temperature, we see maximum south of the Himalayas instead of over the Tibetan Plateau. And in the boundary layer moist entropy, the maximum again is south of the Himalayas instead of over the Tibetan Plateau, as if the Tibetan Plateau is a heat source. And if we focus on the Indian sector, and if we take a zonal average with respect to the Himalayas, we have this lower panel. So 0, because I'm taking the zonal average with respect to the Himalayas, so 0 here means where the Himalayas stand. And there is a clear and sharp gradient across the Himalayas for the entropy, which clearly suggests that the orography here works as a wall to preserve the thermal maximum over India. And here's the results from my control simulation. Strong southwesterlies, strong precipitation, and I guess I can say that in the control, I'm able to simulate what we see from observations and reanalysis data quite well in terms of the upper level temperature and boundary layer moist entropy. And also in the experiment, in the control run, we see that the orography works as a wall to create a strong monsoon. So this plot shows what a moist entropy or theta EB will look like in a year of strong monsoon. Here I'm regressing moist entropy onto a index of monsoon strength. So thick contour shows correlation coefficient, and the shading shows the regression. The shading shows regression coefficient. So the shading is showing you that in a year of strong monsoon, we'll see 3 Kelvin of positive moist entropy south of the Himalayas, which is again in the region of maximum entropy as we see in the control and in reanalysis data, and it confirms that this maximum entropy in North India is really important to the system because it creates a strong thermal contrast between North India and the equatorial ocean that's going to drive the system. And here it shows the monsoon strength in different simulations. The sets of altered orography. Vertical axis is monsoon strength, and x-axis is different experiments. So with decreased height of Himalayas, the monsoon strength almost decreases linearly. And with reduced surface sensible heat fluxes over different regions, there is clear dependence of monsoon strength on the perturbation. As I mentioned, the total perturbation is 3 times in the experiments Tibet than the other 3. So the conclusion here is the monsoon strength is least sensitive to surface flux over Tibet, and it's most sensitive to the surface heat flux over this region, Indian 2, which is again the region with maximum entropy in India. So what we can learn from here is what happens south of the Himalayas is really important. The monsoon system does not care much about what's going on north of it because the Himalayas works as a wall that blocks information north of it outside of the system. Then the monsoon strength is regressed again against the thermal contrast. You can think of as a combination of temperature and moisture contrast between North India and the equatorial ocean, so the thermal contrast between the 2 regions. And according to the theoretical framework, monsoon strength should be highly correlated with the contrast, which is quite true for both sets of experiments with auto-change orography and reduced surface flux. In both of the 2 cases, highly correlated. However, another question arises. The slopes are different for the 2 cases, which is not predicted by the theory at all. And why is that the case? Let's take one step back by examining the monsoon strength via temperature gradient only. On the left hand, we have the set of experiments with autoorography, and on the right hand, we have the reduced sensible heat flux one. So in this case, they are again perfectly correlated, and the slopes look the same because it's predicted by something called thermal wind. It's saying the wind shear, the vertical wind shear should be determined by the meridional temperature gradient, and that's what we see exactly here. Then it must be something wrong going on between the coupling between the boundary layer and the upper level temperature. And indeed, that's true. So we can see in the orography, in the case of altered orography, the slopes is different from the case with reduced surface flux. And the answer is moisture, because when the mountains are removed, dry air will intrude into North India. And here I'm showing the relative humidity anomalies in different experiments. And the upper panels shows what we have in reduced height of Himalayas. So we see when the Himalayas are reduced, it's getting much, much drier. And as you may know, moisture is something very important to convection. When the lower atmosphere is dry, entrainments will get into convection and kind of choke it. In that case, in the dry case, it's very difficult for convection to reach upper atmosphere and couple the upper atmosphere and the boundary layer. And that's the case why we see different slopes in the lower panels. And this plot basically summarizes the previous plot that's saying that with altered orography, we'll have a drier troposphere, and it's going to change the story of convection. And for summary, I hope I convince you that the orography drives a strong South Indian monsoon as a insulation. Because of the following evidence, the monsoon strength is correlated with the thermal contrast, and the monsoon is more sensitive to variations in the moist entropy with altered orography because of the moisture. So what I've done before is mostly about the mature monsoon season, and recently I'm working on the abrupt monsoon onset, which is the transition from a dry season to a moist season. So during the so-called monsoon onset, precipitation will start over India, and it's really important because a delayed monsoon onset is usually associated with drought and heat waves. In fact, 2 years ago, the monsoon onset was delayed by a few days, and then there is a heat wave associated with this that costs lives of 2,000 people. And when people say there is an abrupt monsoon onset, they are referring to this rapid change in different kinds of monsoon index. For example, here I'm showing the Somali jet index, which is the strength of the westerlies over India. And here I'm showing composite results according to monsoon onset. So day 0 is the date that's defined as a monsoon onset. So you can see during the 10 days prior to monsoon onset, the whole circulation really changes abruptly. And so is precipitation. There is little precipitation over India before monsoon onset, and all of a sudden, through 1 week, everything changed into the moist season. So the question I'm trying to approach here is why the monsoon onset is so abrupt. Because as you may imagine, the system is driven by the solar insolation. It should somewhat follow the pace of the solar, which is more sinusoidal compared to this one. So my question here, what I have been trying to answer is why we see such a sudden change. There are many simple theories about the abruptness of monsoon onset, but the problem is, as I said, there are simple models. It's really hard to relate those simple models to the realistic monsoon onset, the realistic Indian monsoon onset. And this movie shows the temporary evolution of precipitation and moisture entropy on this side. Let me play it again. As the season progresses, the precipitation moves northward into India and then retreats. And let's focus on this one this time. As the season progresses, the moisture entropy also moves northward as the precipitation does. So the approach I'm going to take here is to understand this moisture entropy, the evolution of moisture entropy in this area, and I'm going to analyze the moisture entropy budget to identify the physical processes that are important in this transition, so that we can make projections like under climate change, how it's going to change the onset of monsoon onset. It's going to change the monsoon onset, and how it's going to affect the extreme weather like heat waves and droughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, we do have time for questions. If there are any, now's the moment to ask.
Yeah, thanks. Nice talk. When you looked at your WRF simulation as opposed to the reanalysis, there seems to be a little bit of a deviation of theta E, especially at higher levels. Can you comment on that? Is this important for your conclusions? Or?
I guess it's not important for my conclusion here, but as you pointed out, yes, for reanalysis we see very high moisture entropy right here, but in the control, there seems to be some bias. It moves a bit southwards. So the speculation is our mountains are not high enough in the control. So with the resolution again is 40 kilometers, so it's not the best we can do. I guess that's causing the deviation, but to answer your question, I don't think it's going to change the whole story.
Thanks.
Hi, I was just thinking about the previous study about air pollution and wondering if increased levels of air pollution are going to have an effect on surface temperatures and the atmosphere's ability to collect moisture, and if that's going to have an effect on behavior of the monsoons.
Yes, definitely. There are a lot of literature on this talking about the impact of aerosols on the monsoon strength. And in fact, it has been reported that for the past half a century or something, there is a decrease in the monsoon strength, and it has been attributed to the anthropogenic pollution, the aerosols.
Okay, thank you very much again. Okay, so while you're doing that, let me introduce our final speaker. It's Justin Mankin. What I should probably have said earlier is that you're seeing people at different stages of their postdoctoral tenure. It's a 2-year program. Some people are very much at the end of their work, and others are just beginning, and you've seen a little sampling of both. So Justin is going to talk about the curious case of projected drying, but greening in the American West.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, for sticking around on tax day, no less. I want to first thank Gabby and Sam and Natalie, not just for organizing the symposium, but for the tremendous amount of work you guys do to support we postdocs as we try to do our work. So I'm going to talk about this curious case of drying and greening that we see in the American West. And before I do that, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators, Jason Smearden of Lamont, Richard Seeger, who's also at Lamont, Park Williams, also at Lamont, and Ben Cook at NASA. Without them, none of this work would have been possible at all. So I'm a hydroclimatologist, and I'm interested in this question of whether or not we can expect the future to be more or less arid. And the challenge in answering this question about which of these worlds we're going to have in the future is that models can kind of give us indications of both of those worlds simultaneously. And you can really see this effect as represented in these two figures from Abby Swan and colleagues recently. On your left is a map showing annual precipitation minus evapotranspiration, and on your right is a common aridity metric called the Palmer-Grout Severity Index, or PDSI. And both of these maps are trying to characterize something about the water availability at the land surface. And you can see that essentially under high CO2 in the same subset of what we call global climate models, in this case, climate models that are representing active biogeochemistry, which are called Earth system models, that the P minus E world looks generally wetter, denoted by the greens, than the PDSI world, despite the fact that they're trying to characterize the essentially the same quantities. And the reason for this difference is attributable to the differential treatment of what we call surface resistance to evapotranspiration. So kind of the regulation on the atmospheric pull of land water under high CO2. The culprit in this is their representation of vegetation and changes in what we call stomatal conductance. So plants have leaves have pores. Those pores are called stomata, and these regulate the gas exchange between the plant and the atmosphere. And it creates essentially a trade-off between letting in CO2 in order to assimilate that carbon to grow and releasing water to the atmosphere, or losing water to the atmosphere is actually probably a better way to characterize it. And so a kind of a, not universal, not by no means ubiquitous, but a general response of plants to high CO2. As you can see here, increasing CO2 going out to the right. A general response is a decrease in what we call stomatal conductance, which is just a measure of this plant atmosphere gas exchange, essentially. And you can see that stomatal apertures essentially decrease with forcing. And the first order hydrological consequence of this, all things equal, should be an increase in water in things like runoff or in soil moisture. And so just kind of returning to these figures, diagnostic measures like precipitation minus evapotranspiration are kind of representing this physiological response of plants to high CO2, while offline calculations like the Palmer-Grout Severity Index aren't necessarily doing so. But we know, for some reason it's not working, we know, hydrologists know that precipitation minus evapotranspiration may not necessarily be the best way to characterize land-water balance. So in this analysis, what I wanted to do was identify whether or not a prognostic quantity like soil moisture, which is endogenous to the model and therefore should be representing this physiological response of plants to high CO2, whether or not it showed a response that clarified or complicated this divergence, and why. And more generally, I want to kind of understand the answer to the question of what's driving some of the drying that we see in projections of moisture balance over the American West in metrics like PDSI. So unlike the other speakers who are running their own simulations, and I cannot tell you how incredibly time intensive it is to do what they do. So everyone should be standing in awe of the amount of modeling work that's taking place among the four of us, but in particular the three that came first, because it's a tremendous amount of work to run and set your own simulations. I'm leveraging a national scale endeavor that the National Center for Atmospheric Research puts out, or NCAR, called the Community Earth System Model, or CESM, Large Ensemble, or LENS. And this is an Earth system model, and it's simulating at the global scale 35 times the climate, not just in a pre-industrial era where there are no greenhouse gas emissions, or pre-industrial greenhouse gas emissions, but also from 1920 to 2100. So we're talking about national lab level work, 12 million core hours, if you guys are computer people, of simulation time. So it's an incredible undertaking. But you can see just kind of a schematic representation of some of the processes that the land surface component of this CESM model is simulating, from solving the energy budget to the water balance and biogeochemistry, as well as things such as human land use, ecosystem demography, which wasn't necessarily active in the set of simulations I'm looking at, but certainly things like prognostic vegetation were active, as well as an urban model. So there's a whole lot of processes happening in this model. And what I'm trying to do is kind of diagnose the soil moisture response in an ad hoc way with this set of simulations, which is this model run 35 times, which gives us a really large sampling of the model's representation of internal climate variability. So those are the variations in the climate system that would happen in absence of people and their emissions of greenhouse gases. So just in the spirit of bottom line up front, here's the response of summertime soil moisture in the ensemble average from this set of simulations. So what I'm showing here is from the surface down to 3 meters of depth, which represents all hydrologically active layers in this model. This is the change in soil moisture relative to a world where there are no human emissions of greenhouse gases. And we can see just by the vast areas covered in brown that there's a general picture of pretty robust drying. And if we look at each of the individual layers within the land surface model, these are all the hydrologically active layers, we can see that this picture of drying is pretty persistent and robust from the surface down to depth. So I want to understand what's driving this response, which looks a whole lot like what we saw from PDSI, despite the fact that soil moisture, as we know, is endogenous and is representing this plant physiology. The other thing I want to understand are the spatial heterogeneities in this response, because we can see things like insignificant but wetting in the soil column, as well as just this remarkable drying that we see across the Rockies there. So to address this, what I did was break the domain down into subregions, the Northwest Coast Region 1 here, Southern California Region 2, and the Montane West Region 3. And what I'm showing here at your right is a time depth contour plot of soil moisture change. So from the surface down to 3 meters of depth from 1920 to 2100 for each of those three regions. And you can just see the differential response across the three of them, from modest drying in the Northwest Coast to wetting in Southern California to highly significant drying in the Montane West, or the largest of the three regions. So to understand the drivers of this soil moisture response, I essentially built an offline model of soil moisture tendencies and performed a budget analysis. And I'm just going to show kind of the summarizing results of that here. So what I'm showing here on your left is the change in the supply of total water year precipitation, which is in purple, and then its components, total water year rainfall and water year snowfall for Southern California. And I'm showing the full distribution. So this is the distribution that's attributable to the model representation of internal variability. And I'm showing that relative to the change in summertime soil moisture along the y-axis. And we can see that Southern California exhibits a modest increase in supply and a modest increase in soil moisture, but spans the possibility for decreases in both, just attributable to internal variability. And if we add the result from the other two regions, the Northwest Coast, which I've outlined here in green, and the Montane West, which I've outlined here in purple, we can see that both of these regions that are exhibiting drying in spite of net increases in supply, large increases in total water year precipitation that are coming from large increases in water year rainfall that are compensating or offsetting decreases in water year snowfall. And if we look at the demand side, which I'm showing here on your right, we can start to see why that is. So what I'm showing are water year total changes in evapotranspiration. And for these two regions, we can see that there are net increases in total demand, and that's coincident with the decrease that we see in soil moisture, while there's equivocal changes to no changes in the Southern California case. And if we just break ET down into its components, transpiration, which I'm showing here in red, canopy evaporation in orange, and soil evaporation shown here in yellow, we can see that for these two regions that are exhibiting the robust drying, that essentially all of the changes in ET are attributable to canopy water fluxes. So changes in the amount of water that's transpired by plants or evaporated off of their leaves. And to me, as I'm not an ecologist, this response was a bit confusing because the first order expectation that I had going in was that stomatal conductance decreases would increase surface resistance to evapotranspiration. And we should see, essentially, we shouldn't see too many large changes necessarily in evapotranspiration. And we should also be seeing things like increasing plant water use efficiencies. And in fact, if we look at time series of water use efficiencies, which is essentially just a measure of the water cost of carbon assimilation for vegetation, I'm showing these time series for the model ensemble from 1920 to 2100 for each of the three regions, Northwest Coast, Southern California, and the Montane West, and I've put them above those soil moisture contour plots that I showed you earlier. We can see that all three regions have increasing water use efficiencies. So essentially, carbon assimilation is getting cheaper for the plants in the model, but that this cheaper carbon fixing doesn't necessarily imply water savings within the soil column, as denoted by the fact that there are large increases in water use efficiency that are coincident with drying in the two robust drying regions. And I really want to understand this response because if it occurs in the real world, it does upend at least an expectation that I had about vegetation potentially being a panacea to the increased atmospheric pull that's going to happen on soil water as the world warms. And so I began investigating the response of vegetation within the model to kind of get a better sense of what's going on. I'm just going to briefly show you some of the highlights here. So if we look at monthly climatologies of just kind of a proxy of photosynthetic activity called gross primary productivity, or GPP here, for each of the three regions. These are just climatologies from January through December in a world with pre-industrial greenhouse gases and really high greenhouse gases at the end of the century. We can see that for all three regions in all months, there are increases in photosynthetic activity, but particularly so in the two regions that exhibit the most robust drying in the soil column, the Northwest Coast and the Montane West. And if we add leaf area index, which is just kind of a measure of vegetation canopy density, you can see that there's this really clear picture of large-scale increases in prognostic large-scale increases in carbon assimilation by the land surface in response to CO2 forcing. And particularly so in the two regions that are exhibiting drying. And I didn't talk about it today just for virtue of time. I think a lot of this is primed initially by changes in phenology due to decreased snowpack in both the Northwest Coast and in the Montane West, which allows things like the seasonality of when vegetation greens up and when it starts drawing on soil moisture earlier in the year. But what's pretty clear is that LAI increases, this measure of vegetation, increasing leaf areas are outpacing any decreases in stomatal conductance from high CO2, leading to state change of drier soils in these two regions. So to the extent that we associate a greener world with a wetter world, we have indications of both a more arid and less arid future within the same model. So we have drying in the soil column that looks a whole lot like PDSI, and we have increasing water use efficiencies and blooming canopies, which we kind of associate with humid places. You can ask the question, like I did, is this something that just affects the American West? And I'm just beginning an investigation that's starting to explore this, but it doesn't look like it does necessarily. So what this figure is showing, much like the original figure I showed you, is the column integrated 0 to 3 meter soil moisture within this set of simulations. For the entire globe, you can see that there are places with wetting, but you can also see a number of places such as Europe, the entire Amazon basin, and most of North America that exhibit drying. What I've overlaid on this figure is significant increases in leaf areas. So where canopy densities are increasing, where there's more carbon assimilation by vegetation in the land, that's any place that's uncovered. So if you see red hatching, that means that leaf areas are not significantly increasing. So anywhere where you see brown colors that are uncovered, that essentially means the concurrent drying and increasing leaf areas simultaneously. So for me, this begged an additional question, which is the possibility, and this is something kind of my colleagues and I who are working on this have been kind of toiling over, is, if this model response is real, does it pit people against ecosystems for future water resources? And I think, I think the answer is debatable. It may. Here's one possible way to answer this. I created an index that I'm calling blue water loss, which is essentially just a measure of the amount of water that people lose access to, essentially due to this increased canopy flux. So anywhere where you see brown, essentially that's water that where there were no change in vegetation in response to the climate, that people would have access to additional runoff, and that's runoff that's lost. So any place that's blue, that's runoff gained. You can ask a bunch of questions about why we're getting this response, but you'll note that it mirrors the change in soil moisture, as well as the changes in LAI that I showed you earlier. I think the blue areas are probably attributable to the model representation of runoff as just essentially a saturation excess parameterization. So if you have increasing precipitation intensities, which is one of the things this model simulates, more of that water is just going to pulse off the land surface, and so that's kind of what's going on here. But it does suggest that ecosystems not only dry out the land surface, but remove water that could have been available for productive or consumptive purposes. So the other thing that's notable about this is that there's drying in the soil column in summertime, which implies potential interannual drought, and it begs the question of whether or not the vegetation, despite these increases in leaf areas, are actually quite happy. So I wanted to know, are the forests in the model actually okay? And there's a member of the audience, Pierre Gentine here, who knows much more about this stuff than I do, so you should direct your questions towards him afterwards. But in CLM4 and in CLM 4.5, these are the land surface components of this CESM model that's being used here. This phenomenon called plant water stress is parameterized by this quantity called BTRAN, which is, as you can see, we've talked a lot about parameterization schemes here today. This one is incredibly simple. It's just a linear function in soil matrix potential. So the plant goes from being non-stressed at 1 to totally stressed out at 0. So essentially the way it works is that BTRAN in CLM4, the version that's used in these simulations, it's down-regulating photosynthesis, not quite analogous, but in a way that's similarly analogous to the way an isohydric species tries to maintain constant leaf water potentials in the face of decreasing soil water potentials. And if we just look at the seasonal cycle, similar to those figures I showed you earlier of this parameterization, we can see that for the two regions exhibiting drying, there's actually a decrease in plant water stress in the spring, a modest increase in plant water stress in the montane west during summer. But it's not changing a whole heck of a lot, or certainly not as much as expectation might have. And we know from a bunch of people, such as Dan Kennedy, who's been working on an implementation, a better implementation of plant hydraulic stress in the new version of CLM, CLM5, that this doesn't have a physical basis, that it's poorly constrained observationally. It's not considering legacy effects of drought. And all of those things, if they were better resolved by the model, would certainly have an influence on this picture of ecosystem health that we're seeing, and therefore these net changes in canopy water fluxes, which are drying out the land surface. So there's a bit of a conundrum here that I think it needs to be puzzled through, and I'm hoping to be part of the effort that does that. I think that coupled with a bunch of other sources of structural uncertainties within the model, such as the representation of nutrient limitations in this version of CLM. Plants are effectively using nitrogen for free. I can talk more about that if you'd like. As well as things like a lack of hill slope hydrology, which would really affect the representation of hydrological processes over the montane west. It's kind of unclear necessarily, how much worse or better the picture of drying that we see over the American West in these model projections might be. I think from a hydroclimate perspective, you're not really avoiding these issues if you're diagnosing the land surface with a quantity like precipitation minus evapotranspiration. Because soil moisture, which I've shown you here, sets the boundary conditions for the evapotranspiration in that calculation. So just to briefly summarize, we have a really robust drying signal in the soil column, and it's consistent with offline measures like PDSI, and this response is really driven by increased canopy water fluxes. Despite this physiological response of plants to increase surface resistance to evapotranspiration. And I think it's clear that model choices about vegetation really matter. So the ecosystem modelers should be quite happy. I think we in the hydroclimate community are only kind of coming, or at least in our group, are only coming to the realization that vegetation is quite important rather. I think some of this work can start to resolve the paradox around different characterizations of the land surface going out in the future, whether or not there is robust drying or wetting. And I think that while future versions of these models will likely ameliorate some of these issues, these structural deficiencies likely plague all of the CMIP5 models that have been used to kind of make drought assessments for the last few years. And I think that's really important because we're kind of in this learning state with regards to the representation of vegetation on things like hydroclimate. So if we're not getting soil moisture right, we're not going to be getting things like runoff right, we're not going to be getting things like turbulent fluxes to the atmosphere right, potentially things like hydroclimate extremes, et cetera. So in the meantime, I think there's a tremendous amount of exciting work to be done, and I'm looking forward to doing that. So with that, I will take your questions.
Thank you very much. So I have a question.
Yes.
Why did you use RCP 8.5? And explain to the audience what that is.
Sure. So RCP 8.5 is representative concentration pathway 8.5. The 8.5 is the radiation imbalance at the top of the atmosphere by the end of the century with 8.5 watts per meter squared. And it's essentially a scenario of greenhouse gas emissions that's been put into units that are more useful for modelers. So it's a high emissions world, essentially. And the reason that I used it is because that's what the model ensemble used. As I mentioned, that's a national lab effort, and they chose to run it in a high emission scenario.
Yeah, and it is, just so everybody knows, it is a kind of worst case scenario.
Well,
it's a high population growth, it's nobody learns anything. It's the worst case scenario.
I think the worst case scenario is that it can always be worse. Yeah, we can. We're on track for an 8.5 world, and certainly, well, maybe we'll avoid tax day discussions about politics. But I think what's clear is that the emissions trajectory that we're on, the climate commitment that we're facing. It's certainly not something you can rule out.
Of course. And just to compliment Justin, he neglected to mention that one of these, there's a paper in review, right, and one in preparation on this work.
Yep.
So you'll see this in press fairly soon.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Really nice talk, thanks. Just a quick comment. You end by saying, if this is true. And I would just point out there's thousands of studies that show that that is probably the most consistent plant response to elevated CO2 is an increase in leaf area.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think it's highly likely to be true. And the other comment would just be that increases in soil temperature also pretty uniformly increase the root to shoot ratio in favor of shoots, which furthers the allocation of carbon to the green part and the increased use of water.
Yeah, those are both great points. Two quick responses. On the first point of kind of this being a ubiquitous response, I think the challenge here is we don't have a great sense of potential nutrient limitations, and a lot of the experiments that are observationally kind of constraining this phenomenon, are ambient climate conditions with CO2 enriched environments, and it's not really getting at some of the changes in the distribution of extreme events that would, such as interannual drought, which we know has these consequences for carbon assimilation by vegetation and just ecosystem health, which makes them more vulnerable to pests and to blight and kind of all these other things. But you
have to grow the leaf for something to eat it or something to.
For sure, yeah. And to your second point about kind of the carbon allocation, I think there are still some structural uncertainties in carbon allocation schemes within these ecosystem models. And so you could imagine that some of what we're calling CO2 fertilization effect here or whatever, or changes in phenology just due to changes in radiation which allow growing seasons to initiate earlier, could be wonky behavior in the carbon allocation scheme within the model, which we know isn't particularly well constrained. Pierre.
Sorry. Thanks. Nice talk, thanks. Just one question. So you showed that most of the drying is in the end happening in most of the Rockies, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of that is due to basically precipitation falling as rainfall as opposed to snowfall. How much is the melting of the snowpack a little bit earlier? So I don't know if you've been, or just the temperature increase so that you have like a longer period for the growing season altogether. So have you tried zooming into like periods, like even like month to month variations of soil moisture, trying to see when this is actually happening in terms of the changes?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think there are a couple of things that are happening in the Montane West. Some of it, just within the model response, certainly snow and changes in snow accumulation and melt are hugely influential in that area, and we did kind of do a holistic analysis of snow, and I didn't present it here today. But what you do see is really drastic declines in things like March snow accumulation, which is essentially a summary of the amount of snowpack that accumulates over the winter season, and that snow running off the land surface earlier in the year. I think there are different questions about the extent to which, actually I could probably, so in this figure, these are correlations for each of the three regions, the Northwest Coast, Southern California, and the Montane West, and I'm showing the correlations in the historical climate, interannual correlations, so these are detrended, so I've removed the forcing signal, so this kind of gets to some of your question, not totally to your question. Precipitation, snowpack, and transpiration, and these bars are these correlations. So this is kind of, you can think of it as how meaningful a predictor of is each of these quantities for summertime soil moisture. And each of these bars is going down in the soil column, so from the surface down to 3 meters of depth. And the darker colors are the historical climate, and the lighter colors are the future climate. And so for the montane west, you can see that snowpack generally has a pretty high interannual correlation at depth. Not quite about 0.3. It looks like, and kind of decreases slightly as you go to the surface in the historical climate, and decreases generally at all depths going in the forest climate. And you can see that a lot of that is gained by increases in transpiration, though you wouldn't expect these to add to one. The point being that snowpack is important in the historical climate for interannual variations in summertime soil moisture, and it certainly decreases under forcing, but it's not, at least based on this interannual correlation analysis, it's not a principal driver necessarily, so it's crucial. But what you do see, interestingly, is if you just kind of look at time series, and I can show you. Actually, this may actually help you here. So again, this is correlations, monthly correlations from September through August for the montane west, shown here for precipitation, snowpack, and transpiration. And the figure you want to focus in on is this one. So in yellow, or orange rather, you have the kind of monthly correlations of June, July, August soil moisture with monthly values of snowpack, and then in the future climate. And you can just see, there are still important correlations of snowpack that lasts into June, somewhat even in July and August, that are contributing to JJA soil moisture in the montane west, but it essentially just disappears by June in the future. And you can see, just if you just compare the purple distribution to the orange distribution, just kind of a weakening of that correlation and kind of a push towards earlier in the calendar year. So certainly there's a major contribution, but I think more fundamentally there are questions about the fact that this model isn't representing variable soil depth, which we know is going to be hugely important in the montane west, where complex topography and the kind of bedrock depth is really going to determine how much soil moisture gets recharged versus what runs off, et cetera.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi. Thanks. That was great. I had 2 questions about soil moisture and how they were incorporated in the model.
Sure.
The first is about that plot of the matrix potential against the crop coefficient, or how effective it was. I know that varies hugely between species and between plants that, are desert plants or wet plants, in terms of what the matrix potential is. So I don't know if you looked at any soil water characteristic curves for different systems, or if whoever developed this model did.
Yeah.
Because that seems important. And the other question, which I'm assuming they incorporated, was the growth in response to more soil moisture. Because now it seems like, okay, we have transpiration, which is impacted by soil moisture, and growth, which is impacted by CO2 concentration. But in reality, the growth would be highly impacted by the soil moisture content as well.
Sure.
So those are the 2.
Yeah, those are great questions. So you're right. Sunny mentioned earlier that her ecosystem model had 15 plant functional types. This also has 15 plant functional types, and this quantity B-tran here is a function of the different kind of plant functional type assemblages within the grid cell, and then kind of the weighted fraction of roots within that soil layer, right? So it is kind of integrating, or attempting to kind of integrate all of the effects that you're talking about, which is kind of not just the change in the plants that are covering the land surface as you move from point A to point B, but how the thing about this is that in this set of simulations, the kind of assemblages themselves are prescribed. So there is an ecosystem demography kind of changes happening. So you won't have, you know, a kind of an evergreen shifting from grid point A to grid point B just based on suitability. That's prescribed in this set of simulations, but you will have changes in the carbon assimilation by that evergreen within grid point A based on things like changes in soil moisture and radiation and all the other things. So all those are kind of within the model and being dealt with. Does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you very, very much. So let me just summarize briefly and then start thanking people. What you can see from these sorts of discussions is that the question of will the temperature increase in the future is no longer a question. How much the temperature will increase in the future for a given increase in CO2 and other greenhouse gases is an open question. How the Earth will respond to a given temperature increase is an incredibly open question, full of contradictions and conundrums, as you've heard. So that's the sort of thing that postdocs, PhD students are working on. It's incredibly important work, and I thank them all for doing it. I thank you all for coming. I thank everybody who asked questions, and these people will hang around for a while if you're shy and want to ask them a question on your own. I thank the organizers. There will be another one of these in the fall, different people. And particularly thank Natalie, who I believe has a whole army of clones locked up in a closet somewhere, so she can get one out and do the work that she does. So thank you all very much. Hope to see you in the fall.